All right, let's jump right into this. We are standing between you and potentially happy hour or some great Friday evening activity. So we want to make sure we can have enough time for these awesome presentations, and then of course some time for Q&A afterwards. So we'll jump right into it now. So welcome everyone to Designing Through Complexity. So my name is Josh Foster. I'm adjunct professor at Long Beach City College out in Los Angeles County, and current ACSA board member. So this session highlights how architecture and design education can help us navigate increasingly complex social challenges, whether it's in the classroom, in contested civic spaces, or in our neighborhoods. Our first presentation of three is going to be Dangling the Carrot by Ping Liao. Um, Really, what this does is examines the role of peer assessment in architectural education. The study explores how tools like CATME and SPA factor can shape collaborative behaviors, accountability, and even stress in student group projects. The research points to both the positive drivers of enforced accountability and the risks of transactional teamwork, raising important questions about how we can cultivate authentic collaboration in design studios. Following that presentation, next we'll have Serena Langdon Dimitrion, and we're going to be looking at understanding stories of trauma and hope through architecture. And so, what this presentation does, it brings us into the lived experiences of immigration detention using Chicana feminist methodologies and testimonial narratives. This project translates firsthand stories of asylum seekers into architectural renderings, collages, and drawings. The work reframes architectural documents as tools to reveal and resist dehumanizing carceral spaces while foregrounding the resilience and humanity of those impacted. And then lastly, we're going to be following that up with a presentation by Wesley Hyatt, entitled Migration and Displacement in a Small American City. And so this presentation explores Bethlehem, Pennsylvania as a microcosm of broader mitigation and housing pressures in small U.S. cities. Through the Alley House program, students, municipal officials, and residents are co-developing land use reforms and new housing types grounded in local history and in storytelling. By reviving the Alley House as a familiar, community-rooted solution, this initiative seeks to transform conflict into opportunity and provide a replicable model for other cities. So overall together, these projects really reveal the many scales at which designers navigate complexity from the interpersonal to the institutional, from the politics of migration to the histories embedded in housing. And each reminds us of the responsibility and possibility of architecture to serve as a tool for negotiation, healing, and for transformation. So we're going to jump right into it. Each is going to introduce themselves as they get started, and we're going to have what I'm sure will be a great discussion following. And so we'll start off first with Dangling the Carrot. Ping, you can go ahead now.
Thanks so much, Joshua. Um, Good afternoon, everybody. Nice to see you all here. So I'm currently teaching in Singapore Polytechnic. So I'm a lecturer over there, and I'm also in charge of not in charge, I'm part of the teaching and learning unit. So we guide lecturers to enhance their pedagogical practices in the department. So I'm also currently finishing up my PhD before it finishes me. So that would take a couple of months to come. Hopefully everything should go well. Okay, I'm going to share my screen now. Um, hmm, yes, when missing. Give me a second. So weird. It was here just now. Oh, okay, sorry. I'll get into. Okay, I do believe you should be seeing my screen right now, so I'll just get
Yes.
started. Thank you so much for telling me that. So this is a work that has been co-authored with a fellow colleague of mine. Unfortunately, she's also on traveling trips, so she couldn't be here. Um, all of us we know that in never mind in the design studio, in the world that we are living in, there is a lot of conflict that's ongoing. If we were to zoom specifically into our context in the design studio, There are conflicts that's happening here and there, but arguably the conflicts that we are talking about it is not between teachers and the students because of all of this in the discrepancies in the power distributions in the studio. I think it will take a lot of courage for our students to to have like a friendly argument with us because the grades will be at stake. So so this study is predominantly contextualized within the relationships between student and student. And I do believe that we do observe that a lot in our institution, specifically with regards to teamwork and group work. Never mind that there are subtle differences between them. So generally, we are talking about students working together towards a common outcome at the tail end. So architecture education, I do believe there's an important gap for us to fill in. So we have not really spoken about conflict mediation and resolution, because all we are generally interested in is the formal aspect of the design. So conflict often arise during group works, because there are differences of perspective amongst the student, and when all of them come in to chip into their own group work, the different perspective often causes frustrations for them. I think most of us we might have the same sentiments as well. Not to say that it is not a good thing. I think we tend prefer students and including us when we are students, we do prefer independent design work because we might find collaboration a little bit restrictive. So therein the whole assertion that probably, in architecture education, we have failed to equip students with sufficient teamwork and communication skills. So to really tackle problems like this, our institution has mandated whenever you have a long span group project that crosses about 4 weeks or so, and then there is a system that is put in place for students to leave their self and peer assessment feedback. So just now when Joshua was talking about SPA, so it refers to self and peer assessment feedback. So this is the kind of criteria that students are being asked to rate both themselves and as well as their peers in to understand how effective they are in terms of teamwork and group work, but specifically teamwork. So the number one criteria is to evaluate themselves and their peers on their contribution to their team's work. So do they share the amount of group work, the workload, sorry, or even though they're actively participating, their contribution equates to having value in the team. Criteria number two will be interacting with teammates. So that is pretty straightforward in terms of communication, whether communications are being made in a respectful manner. And number three is more of whether the students are helping to keep the teams on track. So whether each of this meeting are they focused or they are beating around the bush or they end up in the cinema instead. Expecting quality, to see whether they are on par with one another's expectation in their work. So that probably translates into their intrinsic motivation in achieving higher standards for themselves or not. And lastly, they are to rate themselves and their peers on whether they well equipped with sufficient knowledge, skills, and abilities. So that is our KSA, and whether they are well equipped to drive to project across. So for example, so at the end of the day, there's a very interesting mechanism that amalgamates everything into a singular score. So that score is very important for them because it affects the entire um, um, scores that they are receiving for themselves. So, for example, William, Timmy, and Jessica, they are in one team. Obviously, there should be more friends, but just stick to three for the time being. So the system will compute like a score, like a SPA factor for them. So, for example, after the reviews, after the blood splits and slit throats, sorry. So, if William, he has attained a SPA factor of 0.95, and Timmy, who is the freeloader or have other factors who is preventing himself from contributing actively, receives a score of 0.5. And Jessica, who really works terribly hard to make up for all of the discrepancies. So, for example, with all of these dynamics in play, the group score is 65. So, what happens for the final individual score? So, 65 will be multiplied by their SPA factors that they're getting. So, let's zoom into Timmy. So Timmy, his contribution is arguably half, which means that 65 times 0.5, he will not be able to pass this assignment. So these are the very critical implications that students will know and face for each of this. So in our institution, we have mandated that it is not like a short-term engagement. So we are expected to spread all of our teamwork assessment and engagement throughout the entire program, which is a 3-year program in our school. So this is roughly more or less how it's being distributed across the 3 academic years. So the research aim is very simple. I'm not too sure about you, but when I started, what really drove this is cynicism. I'm not too sure whether all of this very calibrated and very intense consequences will have any impact on their intrinsic collaborative behaviors and as well as mindset. So there's two research questions that's guiding this study. How would the SPA factor influence year two's architecture students and behaviors towards active participation and responsibility? And number two, would it alter their propensity to collaborate? Would it change their very genuine way of behaving as themselves into something which is more calibrated? So, you may be asking why year two architecture students? Year two, if you were to reflect back on this, by the time they're in year two of their study, they would have experiences of going through this system. So the students that has been administered for this qualitative survey, they would have completed the third, at least the third mandatory milestones that has been enforced on them. So this study is also IRB approved. So the participation is voluntary. We will not be able to track who they are. So there are there are four open-ended questions for for the participants to reflect on, and they are explicitly being tasked to say that you should explain more in about 3 to 4 sentences, but we only get 1 to 2 sentences, which is better than nothing. So the open-ended questions are: how would the SPA factor influence your attitude in collaborating? And I'll get them to describe a situation where SPA factors has impacted the way they have collaborated. So it could be better or for worse. And question number three, what are their own personal thoughts about the SPA factor itself, and how does the SPA factor affect their natural inclination to work collaboratively? And just to get them to think, if in the future, without this SPA factor in place, would they have learned how to collaborate, how to communicate well? So we have inputted all of the data. So you see, it's not necessarily 3 to 4 sentences. So we inputted all of this data in the Atlas TI program, and we tried to use the function called intentional AI coding, which is quite interesting, to be honest. What is really interesting is that it allows us to input the research question so that there's a certain level of contextualization so that the Atlas TI will be able to do their work. But of course, the golden rule is that we do not depend on the AI so much. So every step of the process, the human will always be kept in the loop. So all of the themes, the trends, and the patterns, they reviewed by myself and my co-author as well. So just to expound a little bit on the first research question, two themes has been identified. So let's go to theme number one, which is enforce collaborative measures into positive drivers. So from the student quotes in the middle of this page, you could see that there's some kind of positive reactions to it. So SPA factor makes the students to be more aware of the different aspects to be taken into consideration. So it is not about just producing quality work. It is also about the process of getting into the final submission. Students have also mentioned that it is a necessary pressure. I'm glad they take it to heart. But another has added, it certainly acts as a constant lingering reminder for them to actively contribute. So there is a certain sense of an extrinsic force that is exerted upon them. So interestingly, despite its mandatory nature, students have seems to suggest that they have taken to it positively. And as we move on to on this set of slides, you could probably sense that it has intrinsically shaped their value systems and behaviors. So what we are talking about is a series of enhancements or hopefully enhancements in their soft skills, the ability to collaborate, and most importantly, that reflective aspect that is enforced to them. I think it starts to crystallize some of the thoughts that they may have moving forward. So theme number B is enhance measures as negative risk factors in collaboration. So this is when it's all not milk and honey, but it can be like slit throats and blood spills. So but one of the participants have mentioned that the spa factor has made him to be nicer, and because they kind of understood that everybody has a share to influence their grades. And all of the grades that they are getting at the tail end, it is really depending on their friends' grace and objectivity. So that's interesting because it changed their behaviors. Maybe they do not flip the table at the first moment, but to self-regulate and to talk through things. And then and yeah, so all of these risk factors have arguably affected their collaborative behaviors. So we could probably say that all of this engagement have became slightly transactional. And subsequently all of this guarded conversations might also increases their stress over the period of time. So just to really sum it up very quickly, they'll be on their toes with every conversations that they're making. So another aspect of it that participants have really come to terms that spa factor can be a tool of leverage where they can use it to threaten the inactive members. And this is important because there is also be a chance that you will tear apart friendships. So of course when such power is being bestowed to them, they can end up to be cynical to say that when worst comes to worst, they can weaponize this SPA factor to drive collaboration. So such anxiety may lead to conversations that really talks about how they present themselves to be a equitable member rather than someone who is more towards coercing their teammates to get work to be done. So, which is where the stained friendships may emerge. So then it brings us to mind whether all of this intrinsic collaboration and mindset will be operationalized. So this is team C, which is addressing research question number two. What is really interesting and it surprised me a lot is that they have concluded to a certain extent that yes, as spa factor is a necessary evil, but moving forward, they seems to have grappled with transiting into something which is more transactional, into a more genuine way of collaborating, even when the spark factor is not in place. So that is somehow encouraging because they have mentioned that it will become a habit for them to do their best in every teamwork project. And they have also reflected that they have learned how to collaborate, how to communicate through this exercise. So just to sum it up, so there is a duality to it. We can't get the best of both worlds. So in the initial moments of the spark factor, arguably there is a necessary evil. They may tend to feel calibrated. They will maybe, it they are putting on another hat when they are talking with their friends. So, but at the tail end, I think there's no 100% foolproof system because spa factor allows the tutors to really get a heads up. So in the event that when we receive the intermediate re in the report in the in the middle of the process, and we if from our eyes, if we can observe if we observe that something is not going in a very good way, and we cross-reference with the reports that we are seeing, it allows us to really mitigate this situation before World War III begins. So thank you for listening. So this is the end. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you very much, Ping. Excellent work.
Thank you.
So we're going to move right along to our next presentation. So Serena, you can take it away.
Great, thank you, Josh. Let me switch to, um, is this, can everyone see this?
Yep, looks good.
Great. Um, so hi, my name is Serena. I am a recent graduate this past May from the University of Colorado Boulder in architecture and in ethnic studies. And I am going to be presenting today about the project that I did for my honors thesis. And since graduating, I have continued to work in sort of similar themes. I'm currently working on a study looking at the impact of extreme temperature on the architectural sort of features of prisons. So looking at a carceral environment similar to this project. Um, I'll go ahead and get started. Let's see. Did that change for everyone? We're on. Okay, great. So to get started, so the violence that can be and that is created by physical spaces is really acutely experienced by people that are being held in carceral environments. The United States is home to about 200 immigration detention centers, immigration holding facilities, as part of the largest migrant detention system around the world. And across the United States, about 90% of those detention centers are privately owned and thus subject to very little oversight. And the Immigration Detention Center close to where I am from and where I went to school in Aurora, Colorado, is owned by a company called Geo Incorporated. And with a holding capacity of 1,500 people, the Denver Contract Detention Facility, which you can see in these photos here, along with many other facilities across the United States, allow the corporation to generate about $2.3 billion annually. So this is a really significant industry. So through this thesis, I investigated really the architectural forms of the Denver Contract Detention Facility and explored how architectural representations informed by the integration of two feminist research methods represent a novel path to uncover the sort of invisibilized and hidden human stories inside of these types of spaces. So as I mentioned, being a student of both architecture and of ethnic studies, I really wanted this project to integrate two disciplines and, be in its essence really interdisciplinary. And thus I relied on two specific women of color feminist research methods. So first I utilized the Chicana feminist method of testimonio. And testimonio is a style of personal storytelling that's focused on speaking back to systems of power and has been used in many forms throughout history in Latin communities and is being used more and more as sort of a research method. And the intent of testimonial is not only to resist violence and oppression, but also find healing and empowerment through storytelling processes. And this method has been expanded upon in recent years by social psychology researchers to integrate visual elements. So looking at storytelling through drawing, through photography. So I was really curious if there was a way that I could find to engage participants in storytelling through architecture. So then second, I relied on critical fabulation, which is a Black feminist method that was created to bring to life hidden or unreported histories of Black women in the United States. And this has been done primarily by piecing together archival documents and recorded histories to really kind of produce new angles and new understandings. So again, here I was really interested in what I could understand about a building, about how it functions, without having access to the interior through forms of historical documentation. So with these two sort of methods as the goal, I started by expanding upon the multimodal testimonio. And to do this, I met with a number of participants who had personal experiences with the Aurora Detention Center. And in like 1 to 2 hour sessions with each participant, I listened to their stories and I asked them while listening to draw the spaces that they remembered inside the detention center. So, these drawings really became a tool of the conversation. And here are some of the examples of what participants drew. And they really used these drawings to describe like how the spaces felt, where the light was coming from, the sounds, the materials, what they could see, and also how they could and could not move, or were and were not allowed to move. So then also expanding upon the idea of critical fabulation in that method, I gathered and examined numerous documents from governmental organizations, from NGOs, building codes, lawsuits, that type of document. And through these documents, I was able to build representations of the different spaces inside the detention center within which really to situate the stories that I gathered in the testimonial interviews. So here's an example of a few of the documents that I looked at. The first is a disciplinary report. The second is a list of items that could be purchased inside with commissary money. And the third is a diagram of building standards that dictate how this detention center was built, along with pretty much all of the others across the country. So then at the intersection of both ethnic studies and architecture, I really wanted this project to have really deep engagement with existing design work, in addition to the more like methodological and theoretical groundings that I've spoken about. So the visual explorations in this project were informed by the work of many different architects and designers, a few of which are here and also here. So from the precedent study, I learned about and took a lot of inspiration from more forensic practices, like using mapping, photos and videos, audio samples, to examine and uncover humanitarian and political violence. And I was able to explore more technical, graphic styles, looking at collage, use of black and white compositions, graphic textures, labels, and creating movement to help inform my project. And, I was really excited to have a very diverse array of precedents, work from artist collectives, from social activists, from architects, researchers, writers. So that all really brings me to my design thought process with this work. So first, I started integrating the ideas from the interviews, from the documentation, from the precedents, all into sort of numerous different sketches, and really thinking through like how could all of these pieces of data come together. And then second, I use sort of more traditional architectural, like 3D modeling softwares to create models of the different spaces that became most important from my data. And really, initially, these models were only looking at the different elements of the architectural space. And then I moved into trying to explore how some of the themes and experiences that arose in the data could be turned into graphic representations. So here I was really interested in trying to effectively communicate these like complex ideas, emotions, physical, emotional, human experiences that were happening in this space, and trying to find a way to represent those in, more traditional architectural language and graphic. So that brings me to sort of the culmination of this project, which were these compositions. So I finally, integrated the architectural models that I had created with the stories and the documentation through a collage style. And essentially, I mapped the data that I had from the interviews and the documentation onto the architectural space. And I generated 4 compositions about these like 4, primary spaces that came up during the interviews and in the documents. And this was both the spaces that were the most important during the interviews, but also the spaces that I was, able to find information about through the documentation. There are a lot of spaces within the detention center that were, not documented. So the first one was the courtroom space. This was an internal courtroom within the detention center, sort of understanding the processes and the practices that happen there. Second was a visitation space. This is where folks could come on specified times, specified days of the week to visit people that were inside. Also, a really complex system that had, many different elements to it. The third space that I looked at was the living ward. So this was a sort of more typical living ward, of which there were many inside the detention center. This was a like a male's ward. And this is where, folks inside spent the majority of their time. And then the fourth space that I looked at was the segregation, or what would be sort of commonly referred to as the solitary confinement space within the detention center, and understanding, what this space looked at, how it was different from the living ward, understanding the, what happened here, what, how people ended up here, and what this experience looked like. So to conclude from this project, I think the contributions are really twofold. First, I think the project presents a compelling argument for the power that can exist at the intersection of women of color feminist methods and tools of spatial analysis and representation. I think the culminating compositions really leverage architectural drawing and architectural language as a vehicle for listening to the stories that exist within spaces that often surround us, but are really intentionally hidden. And second, I think that this project used a lot of the language of architectural construction documents, and those construction documents are used, in government approved building standards, which really codify the inhumanity of spaces like this detention center, while in nature really remaining neutral and removing sort of ethical implications from architects. And I think the compositions in this project showcase the power of construction documents to kind of make visible or to question the culpability of the architectural field in, really in essence, like integrating humanity back into these instances of spatial violence and back into these pieces of the architectural language that are often removed from the stories that happen within them. So thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Serena. Great work. And last but not least, we have Wes up next. You can start sharing your presentation now. We can get right into it.
Awesome. Thank you. Can y'all see this?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining on Friday at happy hour time. I promise I'll go quick. My name's Wes Hyatt. I'm an assistant professor of architecture at Lehigh University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and the co-director of the Small Cities Lab at Lehigh, which is a relatively new initiative focusing on urban design, planning, and architectural questions in smaller cities like Bethlehem, where we sit, that have traditionally been sort of understudied and underserved by both the academy, but also really everyone else. So that's going to be kind of the context of the presentation today, which I will jump into right now. So the changing social and economic and demographic makeup of many small American cities have increasingly been the focus of national media and political debate. The Census Bureau reported in 2022 that more people are moving to small cities as larger cities see net losses in population. Viewing smaller cities as relatively more affordable, many affluent professionals and remote workers have moved away from larger metros. The term like a Zoom boom is kind of common in places like Boise or Bethlehem, where we sit. These high-income individuals price out long-time residents, exacerbating housing shortages within these smaller communities. While small cities may see an associated increase in revenue and economic development as a boon, these patterns of migration and their attendant displacement can have a devastating effect on the livelihoods of existing residents. So conflicts arising from these new migration patterns are felt acutely across really small cities across the nation. As displacement and gentrification increase, many small cities are considering how land use change, new housing types, and other forms of technical assistance can help increase housing supply. However, because of limited sort of internal organizational capacities, many small cities are forced to import knowledge and best practices, in quotes, from larger metros, relying on consultant services with tokenized sort of community engagement exercises with proposing changes to local policy. So an example of this knowledge transfer from larger places to smaller ones is accessory dwelling unit or ADU policy. The majority of case studies of ADUs are really from a handful of mostly coastal, larger metro areas with little written about smaller places that have adopted these. However, there are, from our research, over more than 300 small cities across the country that have adopted ADU rules. And they typically work with consultants or adopt model language from institutions like AARP to do so. This consultant-led approach tends to exacerbate conflicts between municipalities and constituents skeptical of external third parties, imposing what is perceived as a top-down process. At the same time, common social and political impediments to land use reform and housing production persist, with new factions of NIMBY housing or homeowners positioning themselves in opposition to existing residents, municipal authorities, and allied nonprofits. But these perennial conflicts around housing and land use reform offer a space for architects, educators, and especially architecture students to envision locally specific models of urban change in small cities experiencing increased migration and housing pressures like Bethlehem. So the rest of this presentation, I'll be talking about the Alley House program, which is an ongoing research, design, planning, and education initiative that employs oral histories and spatial storytelling to directly shape changes to land use policy in the small city of Bethlehem, where we sit. The program is a model for other small cities considering land use change, turning potential conflicts around housing production into opportunities for design and policy reform, while offering opportunities for alignment between otherwise disparate interest groups. A little bit about Bethlehem. During the turn of the century, boom years of Bethlehem Steel, which was formerly one of the world's largest steel manufacturers, alley houses were an infill housing solution for the thousands of migrants and immigrants seeking work at the steel. Built on the alley-facing side of residential parcels, alley houses were built in a variety of shapes, sizes, and types that often, though not always, mirrored their existing street-facing counterparts. Although the majority of these houses are still occupied today, and many informal or unpermitted units exist off-market, construction of new alley houses was gradually rendered illegal during 20th century downzoning that privileged lower densities, which is really, of course, what we see across the country. As in virtually every American city, Euclidean zoning ordinances in Bethlehem have prioritized single-family zoning and housing while restricting multifamily and mixed-use development, and have rendered the majority of the city's neighborhoods to be legally non-conforming. This disconnect between policy and the built environment has effectively outlawed many historic housing types, including alley houses, which we see all three of these are kind of examples across Bethlehem, which these houses once provided affordable, walkable, middle density cities with a range of places to live. Sorry, got mixed up here. So what we today define broadly as accessory dwelling units or ADUs have precedent in the alley houses found throughout Bethlehem and across eastern Pennsylvania and lots of small cities across the region. There are, however, important differences between this historic housing type and contemporary ADUs that have significant implications for future zoning reform and infill development. So as I go on in this paper, I'll discuss how the study of this kind of vernacular architecture, supported by existing condition surveys, oral histories, all sort of collected by students, can directly inform contemporary land use reform in small cities like Bethlehem that are really wrestling with their current zoning that really predates their existing built environment. So quickly, sorry, I got mixed up. Where are we? So just thinking about Bethlehem today in the context, today, as Bethlehem's recent zoning amendments have only become more restrictive, the last time the city updated their ordinance was in 2012, the city faces a deepening housing crisis and strong market rate competition for existing developable land. Unlike many so-called post-industrial American cities, Bethlehem maintained a robust economy after the decline of its primary industry, punctuated by the bankruptcy of Bethlehem Steel in 2001. The subsequent shift of the city's economy from steel manufacturing to the education, healthcare, arts and culture, and tourism sectors saw continued growth throughout the 2010s and 20s. As such, the city experienced nominal amounts of blight that typically characterizes Rust Belt cities across the Midwest and has limited vacant land available for development. And this is just to show that in Bethlehem since 2020, rents really across the Lehigh Valley, but especially Bethlehem, have increased exponentially, outpacing those in Philadelphia. These factors combined have kind of made the housing crisis particularly acute. In 2023, the city of Bethlehem published a study called Opening Doors, which, among other things, identified a kind of crisis level rental vacancy rate of less than 2%, with a 57% increase in rental prices across the past decade. During one community meeting for this housing study, it was found that a prime source of tension in the community surrounds the reluctance to welcome the latest wave of more affluent newcomers during the pandemic, quote, because they are seen as unlikely to respect or fit into the neighborhood fabric, report about the community meeting notes. Overall, including developers, landlords, business owners, and longtime residents, many of whom emphasize that they aren't anti-development, but really kind of anti-this, right? Anti these large kind of buildings that don't really sort of resonate with their lived experience of the city. In response, the Opening Doors report published by the city recommended a pilot ADU program as one actionable goal for increasing Bethlehem's housing supply by effectively doubling the number of dwelling units allowed per parcel. Originating as a year-long research and place-based research and design visioning project, the Alley House program outlined in the strategy was co-developed by local housing advocates, municipal officials, architects, and architecture students in Lehigh University's Small Cities Lab, which we are sort of continuing to work on today. Here's all the kind of partners involved in the Alley House program. We have Lehigh and the Small Cities Lab. We have the city of Bethlehem leading the kind of planning and zoning efforts. Our community development partner, Community Action Lehigh Valley, and their subsidiary, Community Action Development Bethlehem, and New Bethany, which is a kind of local anti-poverty organization. All of these partners together kind of are working with our students to develop this pilot ADU program. So the program includes lots of kind of public education, walking tours, things like this to get folks around the city to kind of understand the idea of alley houses and how to kind of lower the temperature around this kind of scary acronym of ADU. This is just a photo of a walking tour and an associated guide that we produced with students a few years ago. And as I said earlier, the program is really kind of buttressed by a robust kind of archive of interviews with current Alley House residents. There are 919 existing Alley Houses in Bethlehem. This was one interview with a resident named Honey that students kind of went out and conducted both with Honey and her daughter. And there's multiple of these interviews that tell stories about how well, sort of life on the alley, how it's different than life on the street, which is really important to this program, and kind of these interviews have been really kind of critical in building a support for the project and really framing the project and what it should be. So the students also kind of went out into the field and surveyed all 50 miles of Bethlehem Alleyscape, kind of the hottest days of last summer, and produced this publicly available map, which we are still kind of working on to make more accessible, but found, again, 919 existing alley houses, kind of walking around doing an existing condition survey as they were conducting these interviews. So they were sort of linking these material sort of histories and material culture to the kind of lived experience of folks in these houses. All of that work is informing kind of design efforts. So these are images from a exhibition held a few years ago to kind of open up the idea of alley houses and ADUs with city officials. And here's the first of four, hopefully four, if tariffs are nice to us, 4 units that we will build through this program, involving students sort of swinging hammers from the beginning. So this is the first pilot project, Alley House 1, on a lot in West Bethlehem. This has been really important for us in communicating the kind of trade-offs that come with land use reform and zoning policy. So you'll see that this house is sort of elevated right here. This is the kind of 2-bedroom apartment with parking and the entry below. As of right now, the zoning policy does not allow for ADUs. We got a sort of variance for that, but we could not get out of the parking requirement. So the cars are sort of shoved under this rather thin building. And that's been really instructive as the students have talked with folks in the community about, well, if you want to age in place in this ADU, like most folks sort of do, they think of these things as granny flats, things like this, it's going to be hard to walk up the stairs, right? So using these models as a way to discuss these trade-offs between, having parking, you got to typically raise the building, or if you don't have parking, you can have it be a shorter thing, has been useful for discussion. The students are, as I said, building these pilot units. Here's a time lapse of us panelizing the walls in our lab space. We are hopefully breaking ground on site for the first unit that we just saw in about a month, and shipping these panels down to the site to build this building. And the students sort of have been involved across all of that process. So, just some open questions, especially from the architectural education side for me, are, these really long kind of projects, like thinking about zoning and land use reform, and the construction of buildings and the design of buildings. All of these things take time and involve lots of different kinds of partners. So an open question for us is how we can kind of align the Gregorian calendar with the academic calendar, right? Where these students are coming in and out in their semesters, but want to get involved and align with the projects that are ongoing. So that's kind of what we're thinking about on the educational side. And so thanks for listening, and excited for Q&A.
Awesome. Thanks for the great work, Wes. So we're gonna jump into a few guided questions. So I have one question for each of our presenters, and then one more question after that for all of them to answer. And with the remaining time, if any of you that are here in person with us live have some thoughts or discussion points you want to bring up, we're happy to finish off with that. So we'll start back from the beginning with Ping. And so you talked about this a bit. So I wanted to have a chance for you to expand a little bit more, specifically around the idea of how you envision balancing the benefits of structured peer assessment, really when we're looking at it from the risks of potentially fostering anxiety or transactional collaboration among students. And so that balance between the individuals when they're in the space of the authenticity of working together as a team.
That's a very interesting question. Um, I do believe it is pretty much a necessary evil. I think it's a little bit like us taking medicines. You take a medication and then it does the side effects will be there. So I think what is really important is for us to be able to take a look at whatever that's available to us, the data set, and we are able to quickly mitigate whatever situations that might be imminent.
It's a really good point there. And on these questions as well, Serena and Wes, if you have some thoughts based on even who they're directed to, please feel free to add in. But yeah, Ping, I think that's a really good point because a lot of the push toward authentic collaboration, I feel like is really rooted in just that. What's the authenticity behind the individual of wanting to be collaborative? And I think a good way that you're looking forward through this through the peer assessment allows them to be reflective on the process once they really see how it went. And I'd imagine that as this process is something that continues to push forward, like you're saying, they started within their second year. As they finish through the remaining years of their program, hopefully that desire to want to be more collaborative kind of helps them be able to take down that medicine a little bit easier, even if they have to hold their nose and drink it. But yeah.
And it goes back to the whole idea of having that period of time for them to internalize,
Yeah,
because that allows us to crystallize some of the things that we are still grappling with. So I think that process, yeah, I think that process really helps.
that's awesome. And so, Serena, moving a little bit towards what you're doing again, really focusing on how the external factors of the individuals outside of the work that each of you are doing may potentially be integrated and or affected in what this is. And so specifically on your end in translating testimonials into architectural drawings and renderings, how do you navigate that potential tension between representing trauma and respecting the dignity of those who share their stories? A lot of the work that I personally do in Southern California is rooted in community impact and collecting stories and sharing stories, and that's really a hard line to have there, where you're collecting them and you want to share them, but it's true trauma that may be based in them. So how do you really navigate that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it is a real tension and one that I, hope to explore further as I'm just getting started. But I think at least in this project and the one that I shared in the detention center in Denver, I really, the intent for me was to use the architecture as sort of a vehicle for storytelling. And it was a tool in the conversations that I had with participants to help me better understand the experiences they had and to have, help them to share these experiences that are sort of spatially located. But also I guess I would say that the drawings and the architectural language is really a vehicle to display the stories of these spaces that are often hidden and for which stories, are sort of more covered spaces that are more closed. So I think the architecture is I'm hoping to use it as a tool on which people can tell their stories. And it is true that some of those stories have a lot of trauma and a lot of pain and suffering. I think they also have a lot of resilience and hope. And there are, really amazing examples of community and reciprocity that are existing within those spaces. And, so I just really hope that the architecture can be a place for all of those pieces to be shared.
I love that. Yeah, it feels like with that intention of it being a vehicle, it does provide that space for empowerment that the parts of those stories that can be used for inspiration and motivation really has a place to be displayed. So that's great.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yes, please.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, that oral history I think is relatively new to architects as a research method, but it's like really, I think, but it has a long history in its own sort of world, but can be a really powerful tool that we're sort of playing with as well. And I'm wondering, Serena, like, have you thought of ways to disseminate like the words of folks themselves alongside the drawing and or like the synthetic work that you're doing? Because I mean that's it's very tricky, especially when you're dealing with such, like yeah, trauma and really sensitive and brutal topics. And like some folks that we interviewed like said, yeah, please don't share my story actually. But I'm wondering, like what your experience with that is and how you might imagine, yeah, bringing like the words of folks themselves into the world.
And you can maybe even tie back to that. I know you had that one slide where you kind of collage those things together, and I feel like that was a start from my mind of what that might be. But yeah, I'm curious your response.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think on one piece of it, especially with the topic of immigration and in the world we're living in now, like the confidentiality piece was really big in this project. That was definitely something that was complicated navigating. So there were pieces of stories that I didn't include and was asked not to include in this work. And in terms of integrating the words, I think there are some quotes that have been collaged into the sort of compositions that I created. I think it was trying to find a way to use the architecture as a background and to map on top these sort of oral histories graphically and also linguistically. And I'm really curious in the future to hopefully, excuse me, explore this more and different ways that you can find a synthesis between oral histories and architectural work. I had this sort of education in ethnic studies of these like rich oral history traditions, and then in architecture that doesn't, or at least in my experience, hadn't included a lot of those pieces. So I'm curious about the integration, and I'm doing a similar project right now in the prison system, and using the sort of same form of using architectural drawings for formerly incarcerated folks to tell stories about what's happening in that space. And I'm doing it in collaboration with like some sociologists and social researchers. And, so they're obviously more interested in sort of the oral histories, the stories, the social interactions, and then I'm interested in the architectural pieces. So watching that collaboration unfold has been super interesting. I think there's a lot of room to integrate those things into the future. And exactly how, I think it definitely depends on the context of the work. But yeah, it's also important, I think, to have the participants, if they're willing and are able and safe to do so, like share parts of the drawings, be at community forums, at different presentations, and take ownership of the drawings, of the spaces, of the stories, and use the architecture as a tool. So yeah.
That's great. That's really good. Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head in the aspect of it really needs to be interdisciplinary for it to be able to have the holistic point of view of how we can share things. As much as we may all want them to be shared specifically through architectural types of mediums, it may not be the best for every single type of story. So yeah, that's great.
Yeah. Thank you.
And Wes, and actually, it's funny. I totally didn't mention to you this before, but I'm from Philly, so I know Bethlehem very well. Used to go to the Eagles training camp over there at Lehigh growing up each summer. So it was great to see some work
Oh,
being done
nice.
there.
Cool.
Yeah, so I think specifically for your work there, curious how the lessons from the Alley House program are more specific. You did speak about this, but how they can be transferable to other small cities experiencing displacement, and then what elements do you see as deeply place specific? So moreover, it's really how do you balance the desire to replicate at a scalable nature versus things that we just have to make place specific.
Yeah, totally. That's like the core tension in the project, like going back to even like the acronym of an ADU, right? Like that's a thing that folks are sort of rolling out everywhere, but has, various historical precedents, especially in, cities like east of the Mississippi, let's say, in these like pre-zoning sort of historic corridors. But yeah, scaling versus your place specific, I would say the way in which we're thinking about replicating this is really based on like research method and like action method, right? So there's two parts to that. I think most importantly, the action kind of method or like the coalition building part of the project, which I didn't get into that much in this presentation, but really took like 3 years. It's such a long time frame that we build these projects together with our community partners. And I think that hopefully, if we were to do it again somewhere else, that would go quicker because we've learned like ways in which to like spark conversation and facilitate conversation better. We just learn, but really like defining the project and the research question and the kind of the solution together, I think is a really important kind of way to like scale this. Maybe not this project specifically, but the methods, which I think also could translate to different contexts. So like thinking about oral history, these existing condition surveys, really understanding the place itself, and if housing is an issue, which it is virtually everywhere in this country nowadays, how can that place and it's kind of pre-zoning, pre-single family kind of existing conditions kind of inform what's going on, right? And every place is going to be different, and every place will have different needs, right? And this is why in the small cities lab, we're even questioning the term small city, because folks ask us like, well, what is a small city? Is it just under 250,000 in population? That's sort of what we've said, but that's just totally insufficient to describe what a small city is, because Bethlehem is booming, really growing, has a certain kind of housing crisis that is causing certain kinds of displacement. Where if you go to the western part of Pennsylvania, where you're really in sort of Rust Belt, like the kind of hollowing out of these smaller cities, there's a housing crisis there, but it's a totally different question, right? And to say that ADUs are the best thing for both might not be true, right? But if we can work through these kinds of research methods and kind of coalition building exercises, I think maybe we could find a kind of place-based alternative.
I like that. That's really good, and really thinking about it as more of a framework per se is really awesome. And it's funny. I think about an analogy in two different ways, like the difference between in my mind cooking versus baking. In the sense where if you get a recipe for baking, if you put unsalted butter instead of salted, it's not going to turn out the way it should. You probably should follow that
Yeah, totally.
specifically.
Yeah,
Versus cooking, if you put one seasoning versus the other, you're still going to get that same dish. It just tastes a little bit different. So I think really
totally.
understanding that balance of what can be used as a framework as you scale is really important as you're trying to figure out how these things don't have to reinvent the wheel, but still be culturally appropriate.
Totally. Yeah, I'm gonna use that analogy. I really like that. If that's okay with you.
No, yeah, go for it. I
Yeah.
literally just thought out of it.
Totally. I mean, the other thing I would add, because we're all sort of architects and teaching here, is like involving architecture students and in this work. I think it's a kind of way to build ideas in a not so scary way in these places where like it's a pilot, it's a sort of
Yeah.
question. It's not like your world is changing forever. We have some 18-year-olds coming in and just they're curious, right? And it's really helped in Bethlehem and a few other cities like Allentown and Pottstown that we're working in right now to kind of lower the temperature around these really scary. Oh yeah, change is scary. So
Yeah, that's awesome. And so, one final directed question, for all three of you to answer. So across your projects, we really see design being used as a tool to mediate conflict, whether in student teams, in immigration detention, or in neighborhood housing disputes potentially. How can educators better prepare students to embrace this navigator role, tying back to the theme of this conference, really working not just as designers of space, but as facilitators of dialogue and transformation. And what in all three of these contexts you have are really complex context, depending on the timing of these discussions. So how do you really see that for from faculty to students? Any one of y'all that want to jump in first, feel free. I saved the easy question for last, clearly.
I'm happy to jump in. I think thinking, I guess, towards the end of the project that I worked on, I just kept coming back to the fact that throughout at least my architectural education, it was rare. It happened, but it was rare that I, had classes that focused on spaces of trauma, of suffering, spaces, of really vulnerable, spaces and spaces of harm. And I think part of my project questioned sort of whether it's the culpability is the right word, I don't know, but of the architectural profession, and saying like we teach students, these skills, and these skills are being used for, these really challenging situations, challenging contexts. And I guess I just wish that throughout my education there had been more of a balance between looking at spaces, in studio classes or in projects, of looking at spaces that were exciting, that were novel, that were, doing incredible things in the world, that were solving some of these issues, but also not shying away from, saying all of this is incredible, there's incredible work happening, and the reality is that there are these systems that have created these spaces, that architects are a part of. And this is our the tools of our craft and our profession are being used to create these spaces, and just having more, dialogue and awareness around that, I think would potentially be helpful. But I agree, these are really complex, contexts, and complex discussions to be had in within schools and beyond. So
Yeah, it definitely starts with creating the space. I totally agree with that. If the students feel comfortable and even having these discussions, that's a real start. Ping or Wes, you have any thoughts on this part?
I can jump in for a while. So I believe if we are talking about trying to guide our students into authentic collaboration, or never mind collaboration, authentic conversations. So I
Hmm.
do believe it is important to start by looking at the tutors ourselves, which means that we should be mindful of the hidden curriculum that we are dispensing. So the hidden curriculum is understood as the tacit norms of the design studio. So whatever that we are, probably it is over pretty much of a generalization. But if you were to be slightly honest with ourselves, the kind of education systems that we are being brought up, never mind in architecture schools, but maybe in our preschools and middle schools, it is always about the top-down approach where students are passive learners. So there's always this very top-down power structures that is evident in our educational structure. So just if you were to really to get our students to talk in a very open way, it is to recalibrate all of these power structures in the studio so that the learning environment is being shifted to a more equitable environment. So whatever we are talking about, right, discussing right now, this I would reckon it as a very lengthy process. It is not like an intervention test that you take the magic pill and you turn into a collaborative person. So that is very unlikely to happen. So it is has to be a lengthy process that we are able to inculcate in our learners.
That's good. Yeah. So you start off by creating a space, but then you have to create that runway for
Yeah,
for the students to be able to figure it out throughout that process. And I mean,
yeah.
the one of the things, and I can have a whole conversation about this, but I guess that makes it good that architecture education is so long, is that there is a runway for sure that you can do.
Yeah,
So yeah, may it be really making sure that it is a runway that's paved with that type of discussion. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I really like your way of saying it. The questioning of the hidden curriculum that really resonates with me. You know, I my entire architectural education was like kind of hardcore design oriented, learning the tools of architecture in a BS and an MR program. And then I launched, after working for a while into teaching at Lehigh in a BA program, which I didn't really fully grasp how radically different that would be from my own experience until being there. You know, it's a BA program in a Department of Art, Architecture, and Design, so a kind of mix of folks within the College of Arts and Sciences, where the students are taking just a huge range of courses, of which architecture, even if it's their major, is only maybe 60% of what they're doing, right? So they don't actually have the time, and they're like playing sports and like they're doing stuff, the college stuff, right? And that's kind of a challenge and an opportunity of a BA program, I think, is kind of inviting the students to broaden their kind of scope of their education, and then thinking about how architecture fits into that constellation of courses and things you're thinking about. And they don't have time to engage with a lot of the more silly stuff that we do in the hidden curriculum of studio culture, right? So it's a kind of cultural thing there. But I think something that I've learned teaching amongst all my colleagues in the College of Arts and Sciences at Lehigh is, a lot of other disciplines like center like research as like a thing to be learned and to be practiced, instead of in our world, it's like the design studio, you are drawing, you're learning the tools of architecture, right? So I've tried to varying degrees of success and in age appropriate ways to like bring in research methods that I myself am learning in this BA program, and like placing those into the classroom, because I think that provides that space to start to ask these really tough questions themselves, right? The students can like find those questions themselves instead of sort of being dictated to, maybe, or dealing with this hidden curriculum that maybe isn't all that productive all the time.
Yeah, I think that's really good because I mean, there's many things outside of I guess the bubble of architecture and education that really will create much more informed designers if we give them the tools to be able to do it. And research is I believe a big part of that.
Yeah, I think
Any other? Yeah, go ahead.
oh,
Take it.
sorry for interrupting. And
No,
and
you're
it's
good.
it's interesting that I just came off from a discussion that talks a little bit about the hidden curriculum. So generally, as a paradigm, we tend to look at hidden curriculum as a sort of having a negative connotation. But I think the onus is upon us to really to recalibrate the power relationship so that we are able to foster a much healthier, a much more positive hidden curriculum. So that's a very intentional switching to the other side for a better hidden curriculum.
Yeah, I like that because I mean, there's always two sides to one coin, and I feel like when there's another world where all of the things that it seems like we're all really passionate about, our students being able to learn and being a part of these topics, there still is the world of just the structures of education, let alone architectural education, that we need to figure out how best to slot these things in. And so yeah, seeing thinking about hidden curriculum from a positive connotation, we can kind of flip it on its head there and figure out ways to do the same. And so, if there are any other thoughts on this particular question, I want to be able to open up this last 15 minutes or so. If anyone that is attending virtually here has some live questions in the audience.